rebel soul child, got a fist balled. I'm a respawn of ancestors, and I'm blessed.
What's going on, guys? Welcome back to On The Cage MMA. My name is Brandon Eldridge, and today we're going to be running through UFC for dummies. Now, if you're like me, you love the sport, but you're just a little bit slow at learning, that's fine. I got you. This video is especially good if you're just getting into the UFC and into the sport. I can teach you a couple of the basics and hopefully help you get onto your journey about learning and loving the UFC. Okay, so the first thing to note is the UFC itself. What does it stand for? The UFC stands for the Ultimate Fighting Championship. And what does that mean exactly? For so many years there was a debate to see if a boxer would beat a jiu-jitsu guy, if a wrestler could beat a striker. The UFC put it together so that you can do every single discipline all at the same time in the same cage. I mean, when the UFC first started, if you look at UFC 1, you can actually see Royce Gracie still in his gi from where he does jiu-jitsu, whereas now you don't get to wear that, you have to stay in your shorts. And I'll be honest with you, just having one discipline, just being a wrestler or a jiu-jitsu guy, or even just a striker, it's not going to get you too far in the UFC anymore, as all the fighters seem to be a lot more well-rounded. The current and only ever president of the UFC is Dana White. Dana White did have shares in the UFC, however he has sold them for over $4 billion. However, he does remain to still be the president of the UFC. At this point, I just don't see any other man being able to run that company. Now, in the UFC, there are 12 weight classes, 8 being for the men, 4 being for the women. Now, I'm going to break this down for you one by one, and I'll let you see who the current champion of these weight divisions are. Please bear in mind, look at the date that you watch this video, and I will probably Google it to see if it's still up to date with what I'm saying. Okay, we're going to start from high to low. First of all, we have men's heavyweight division. After that, we go down to the men's light heavyweight division. Then we have middleweight, welterweight, lightweight, featherweight, men's bantamweight, men's flyweight. Now we go down to women's featherweight, women's bantamweight, women's flyweight, and right at the bottom, women's strawweight. Now for both men and women, from featherweight downwards, they are all the exact same weight required. So women's featherweight and men's featherweight would both be 135 pounds in weight. Now, I don't think it would happen. However, if the UFC decided to put a man against a woman, technically, weighing wise, they could actually fight each other. Now, my recommendation to you, if you want to learn more about the UFC and the fighters' histories in general, I would watch The Ultimate Fighter. Now, what I did is I paid a total of £7.99, which would work out around about $6 to $7 if you are American. And I paid that for a UFC Fight Pass, which gives me access to every single The Ultimate Fighter season online, and you get to watch every single UFC card that's ever been in the history of the company. So I started by watching The Ultimate Fighter Season 1, where Randy Couture and Chuck Liddell were both the main coaches. In The Ultimate Fighter, you're going to see fighters come up such as Kevin Gastelum, Matt Brown, Diego Sanchez, Nate Diaz, Thug Rose. All of these people went on The Ultimate Fighter. So it allows you to follow their journey a little bit more. From there, you can carry on watching the rest of the careers with the UFC Fight Pass. That would be my biggest advice, although it does cost money, and if not, I'm not saying illegally stream it online, but if you want to, completely your choice. Now, if you want to know about some of the biggest rivalries of all time, this is the list that I think would be good for you to give a watch. First of all, Royce Gracie versus Ken Shamrock, John Jones versus Daniel Cormier, Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz, Chuck Liddell versus Tito Ortiz, Dominic Cruz versus Uriah Faber, and lastly, Ronda Rousey versus Miesha Tate. These are just some of the ones off the top of my head that I think you should watch, get a bit more knowledge of the sport in general. Now, what you also want to do is get yourself some favourite fighters, because it makes it a lot easier to learn if you've got much more of a bigger interest, especially if it's into a personality. For example, I do get a lot of shit for this, but I started watching the UFC when Conor McGregor came along against Jose Aldo with a first round knockout. So after watching that, I then started to enjoy the sport. I started to follow Conor very closely, and then I started to buy the UFC Fight Pass and go back and watch The Ultimate Fighter. And then you start to learn about people like Chuck Liddell, Dustin Poirier, Khabib Nurmagomedov, Dana White, the history of the UFC, and then it all kind of starts to come together, and then your knowledge just grows and grows from there. Now, in the UFC, there is an entertainment side to it. So some of the best trash talkers that I've ever seen is number 1 would be Conor McGregor, number 2 would be Michael Bisping, and number 3, I'll say Chael Sonnen. In fact, I think Chael Sonnen might be better than Michael Bisping, but he's definitely not better than McGregor at trash talking. Now, as much as it is sometimes annoying, a lot of the time it is entertaining, so make sure you get to watch that as well. What would also help is, depending on what country you're from, I would find a fighter from there and follow their career, and get yourself repping in the UFC. Myself, I'm from Watford, which is kind of in Greater London in the UK. Obviously, we've got a lot of big fighters coming out. You've got Leon Edwards, Paddy Pimblett, Molly McCann, Tom Aspinall. We've also got a fighter from my hometown Watford called Sam Patterson. He did lose his first match, but just seeing someone that, one, I've met, and that's two, you know, where you're from, it gets you inspired to learn more about the UFC. Now, if you're like me, the reason you kind of like the sport is because you like how ferocious it is. It's kind of like Roman gladiators going into the octagon and fight each other. So I'm going to give you my top 6 fight recommendations that I would give to any single person looking to get into the UFC. Forrest Griffin versus Stephan Bonnar. Now, at the end of The Ultimate Fighter, kind of a background into it, The Ultimate Fighter was created to try and get more eyes onto the UFC, to prove to everyone that they weren't just a bunch of angry, steroid-taking cage fighters. At the end of this season, this fight in particular won so many people over. It actually saved the UFC from bankruptcy. It was either this or the company went bust. And not only was it one of the best fights that I'd ever seen, and you saw two men giving it everything they've got, Dana was so impressed by the fight at the end, he gave both of them UFC contracts for over 6 figures each. Say Conor McGregor versus natediaz number 2. Conor McGregor was on an incredible run after beating Jose Aldo. He then beat the next 4 or 5 opponents. He then got up to fight natediaz, who got choked out by submission. Now, this was a massive ego hit for Conor McGregor, so the rematch was almost instant, as you will get to learn that the UFC love putting on a good money fight regardless of where the rankings are. But in the second fight, Conor was not backing down, and it makes for a great striking match between the two. And number 4, I would say Whittaker versus Romero 2 was also another great clash between two titans looking to get their way towards that championship belt. And number 3, I would say Gastelum versus Adesanya was one of my top 3. I'm saying this because everyone thought that Kevin Gastelum had no hope whatsoever, and to this day, I truly believe that Gastelum gave Adesanya the hardest fight of his entire career. My number 2 recommended fight for you to watch will be Jon Jones versus Alexander Gustafsson. Now, I honestly believe that Alexander Gustafsson is the only person who could ever have beaten Jon Jones, and he got close. And my number 1 recommended fight, and I truly believe this is the most recommended fight for every single UFC fan, would be Robbie Lawler versus McDonald 2. Jesus Christ, talk about two warriors, talk about a bloodbath, talk about leaving everything inside of the cage. If you don't watch that entire list of fights that I've just given you, please just watch that one, and you will truly understand what these guys fight for and don't get paid enough for. Now let's talk about UFC GOATs. Now everyone is entitled to their opinion, obviously, but the main 3 that get floated about is Jon Jones, George St. Pierre, and Khabib Nurmagomedov. Now for me personally, I truly believe that Jon Jones is the GOAT. He has got 1 disqualification loss on his record against Matt Hamill, but it was for an illegal elbow, which wasn't thrown. Well, okay, no, I'm being biased. It could have been thrown, but as a Jon Jones fan, I just don't want to accept it, you know? I mean, either way, Jon Jones is winning that fight. When it comes to George St. Pierre, you're looking massively a dominant striker, and he changed his game up about midway through his UFC career and then became an amazing wrestler and was able to dominate both on the feet and the ground, becoming champion and retiring a champion. Now we also have Khabib Nurmagomedov. Now everyone's entitled to this again, but I truly believe because he picked up so many wins in Russia, I believe there could have been a possibility that he would have lost in the UFC had he kept going, but he obviously did retire after the passing of his father, which to be fair is completely understandable, and if I was in that position I may have done the same thing myself. However, he just isn't the GOAT for me. It's going to be Jon Jones. But make sure you make your own opinion on this. Now lastly, just to let you know, a lot of people are going to call you a casual, and it doesn't mean anything. It's basically just UFC fans who've been in the game a long time, watching it for a long time. They like to pick on little people who just start to get into the sport. Honestly, don't worry about it. There's nothing bad about not knowing as much as other people. This is the start of your journey, so forget about them. Just be a good person, and when people want to talk to UFC about you, make sure you're teaching them the same stuff I'm teaching you, and maybe even teach them stuff that I don't even know yet. Now I know this video is short, but it was just to give you the basics of the UFC so you can start your own journey. Now if you like this video, I've also got a TikTok channel that you can follow, so don't forget to subscribe to my channel right now, to like the video, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys on the next one.
They are not him, tell him fess up, I get check stub, hella carefree, nothing scares me.